for sure, anyway. So, good morning. Welcome again to First Baptist here, and welcome to those of you that are watching us on Facebook Live, as well as those of you that will be watching us on the TV ministry later this week. I believe today's service runs on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday this week. I think we're current with that. So, we're looking at a series. I want to look at a series for, I'm not sure exactly how long, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 5 or 6. Not really sure. I've been thinking about this for a while. And I've called this, and this, you're gonna love this, okay? Isn't that just really encouraging, you know? I used to tell my students in the book of Revelation, when I had the Revelation class, I'd talk about the story about the woman, who was standing on the moon, clothed with the sun, 12 stars in her hair, ready to give birth to a baby. And meanwhile, there's this big red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and as soon as the baby's born, the dragon wants to eat the baby and all that sort of stuff. So can you imagine that story? And can you imagine telling that story to a bunch of 5-year-olds in Sunday school? Yeah, boys and girls, there was this lady, and she was going to have a baby, and there was a big dragon who was going to eat it, and the kids, freak out and run out of the room, Mom says to Junior in the car on the way home, so Junior, what'd they talk about? And I don't want to talk about it. So, this is a little bit like that, okay? We want to think of the good times and the good things and the good opportunities. We don't want to think about the challenges that the Christian life faces. But the fact is, the Bible is replete with a number of different issues of challenges that we as believers face. And I want to share this with you over the next few weeks because we are living in a realm, in a culture right now. First of all, we're all dealing with a pandemic. And it's very easy to ask the question, where is God in a pandemic? Very easy to ask that question, particularly if the pandemic has struck you. The closest it has come to striking us is that our daughter-in-law and granddaughter contracted it, but they're doing fine. Our granddaughter was asymptomatic. Our daughter-in-law had some issues like a bad cold, but she's a former track athlete, so she's tough. And so that's the closest that we've had to it affecting us directly as a family. My sister and her husband have not contracted it, so there's the pandemic, and there are other things as well. There's just the way that so much of our culture has sort of lost its way. This culture reminds me of Amos when he says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." I think we're seeing a lot of that today, and I think we're seeing a point where we as followers of Christ are definitely in the minority. Not only are we in the minority, but we are viewed as a threat, okay? I told you about Richard Dawkins, the British atheist, who has written a book called The God Delusion. And Dawkins is one of those people that is sort of held up in the culture very highly. And his point is, or one of his points is, and you've heard me say this before, is that not only are Christians wrong, but they're dangerous. They pose a threat. And whenever something poses a threat, it has to be dealt with. And I think we're beginning to see more and more of that in our culture today, that you and I are viewed as a threat. Now remember, Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people revile you and say all sorts of things about you falsely, because great is your reward in heaven." And then there's just other kinds of suffering, physical suffering, pain, anguish, loss, and those sorts of things. So I wanted to start out today with the passage that Jeff read for us a few moments ago, and that is 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 through 10. This is an interesting section, and reading an epistle, just starting at any given place in an epistle, is a little bit like walking up to two people who are having a conversation and then just deciding to insert yourself into that conversation. Now, that can be fine. It can be not good. Sometimes you start to do that and you realize, this is a conversation I don't need to be a part of. You know what I'm saying? I mean, two people are having an intense conversation and they're trying to resolve something, and you don't want to insert yourself into that. Part of it is just the fact that you don't know what they've been talking about. You don't know what the topic is. It may be something as lighthearted as, the Detroit Tigers won their first 2 games, but after that it's pretty much all downhill, which is kind of what we expected. It might be something as benign as that, or it could be something more serious. Now, what has happened here, and just to make a quick comment on this, and I want to move on. Paul is writing his second letter to the believers at Corinth. One of the things that's happened in Corinth is that some individuals, we don't know much about them. Paul refers to them, apparently the way the Corinthians refer to them, as super apostles. Now, Paul uses that term, I think, somewhat facetiously. They're super apostles. And they mean that when these apostles, whoever they were, we don't know much about them, when they compare themselves to Paul. Now, what do we know about Paul? Paul, well, we learned today, had a thorn in the flesh. And he asked God 3 times to take it away, and God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. We know that Paul was also, the Greek word is skenopoios, which means literally a leather crafter. We translate it tent maker, and that's not a bad translation because a lot of tents in antiquity were made from leather. They didn't have canvas or things of that nature back then. And so Paul is a common laborer in their eyes. He is a sweatshop employee. It's like going to, and don't take this the wrong way, but it's like, your pastor theoretically has to get another job, so he gets a job working at McDonald's. Okay, there's nothing wrong working at McDonald's. Don't misunderstand. But if you told your people, you say, well, our pastor is bivocational and he works at the drive-through window at McDonald's. I don't know that would really impress people. Okay, I teach high school students, so that sounds much more impressive, doesn't it? As a bivocational thing. But what was going on here was they were looking at, and by the way, you ever notice that Paul always seems to end up in jail? You ever notice that Paul gets beat up a lot, right? Look at us. That's not happening to us. This is what these super apostles were saying. Now, Paul calls them pseudo-apostoloi, which is false apostles. Pseudo, right? False apostles. And they're claiming that because they are above this whole realm of suffering and weakness and so forth, that they are somehow superior to Paul. And Paul wants the Corinthians to know that it's quite the opposite. In fact, when we get to chapter 12, he's been doing a lot of boasting, but he's been doing it facetiously. Oh, okay, you like apostles who boast? Okay, let me boast. I'll show you some boasting. You want to see what real boasting is? And he goes on in chapter 11, particularly in verse 16, and he boasts about himself. But he boasts about his sufferings, among other things. And he does it to show the Corinthians that how foolish it is for people to come along and sort of blow their own horn, if you will. He says to the Corinthians in another location, talking about these super apostles, they've got these letters of reference. They've got credentials, right? Some of you have watched The Music Man, and you remember when the local school board is always trying to get Professor Hill to pony up his credentials, What are Paul's credentials? Well, these guys have got letters that other people wrote. They have been testified to as how great they are. Paul says, we don't need that. You all are our letters. You are written in our hearts, right? So the evidence of the ministry that we have among you is you yourselves. We don't need letters of recommendation or letters of reference or things of that sort. So it's kind of complicated and it's kind of testy. It's like Paul is trying to teach them some lessons. And he's just finishing up in chapter 12 this string he's had all the way back to 11:16 where he says he's been boasting. I'll boast. You want to see boasting? I'll show you boasting. And then in chapter 12 he says, I must go on boasting. I'm going to keep on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord, right? So you want to know what I've been doing? You want to know? Here, let me tell you about some of the things that have been going on here. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows. Kind of interesting that he brackets it with that phrase there. Was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Sometimes referred to as like a heavenly language, or perhaps just secrets that only God knew. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Now, it's very likely, the commentators go back and forth a little bit on this, it's very likely that this is referring to an experience that Paul himself had, but he's not viewing it as his own. It's nothing in his favor. It's nothing to sort of make him look good. It's something that happened to him, and he was privileged to hear things, not for any reason that he deserved to, but just that's what he chose to do. And so he says, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. And the commentators think that this is sort of a roundabout way of saying, I could boast about myself, but the only thing worth boasting about myself is my weaknesses, because it is when I am weak that I am strong. It is God who uses me during my weakness, so I don't take credit for things. I can't take credit for these things. Let's continue on here. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. So Paul says, I could tell you about all the things I've done. I could tell you about the places I've been and things I've experienced, the challenges that I've had, the revelations that I've had, the Damascus Road experience, the calling of Jesus Christ, and how in Galatians he says, God revealed his Son in me. He said, I could boast. I could boast these guys into the table. I could boast rings around these guys if I wanted to. And I wouldn't be wrong, but I would be inappropriate. But I refrain, he says, so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surprisingly great revelations. And this is the Apostle Paul being given these revelations by God and what is found essentially in his letters and that sort of thing. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. We do not know what that thorn was. There's all sorts of speculation. I'll comment on about that a little bit later. It probably is some sort of physical malady, physical problem. He says in verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. We've all been there, right? We've all been in places where we've asked Lord for physical healing. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Simply put, what he's saying is, Paul, you can do more for me and for my kingdom with this thorn in the flesh than you can without it. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Wow, huh? There's a lot there, a lot in this text. And I really want to go through the ideas that I'm presenting here, and I think I've got the time to do justice to it. But this is a complicated thing. This is not a simple kind of solution, right? So I want to talk, first of all, just about some basic principles from Scripture. The Bible is a narrative. The Bible is a story. It begins in Genesis. It ends in Revelation. And it's creation, fall, redemption, and then consummation. So you have creation in Genesis 1 and 2. You have the fall in Genesis 3, which really goes all the way through chapter 11. The initial fall, the sin of Eve, the sin of Adam, the murder of Cain, murder of Abel by Cain, and so forth, and then it just Lamech and all the rest just becomes a mess. And it kind of culminates with Noah. God just is sorry he even made humanity, because all they ever do is just constantly thinking about doing evil. And so the flood, and of course Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their 3 wives are essentially a new Adam, a new Adamic family. They're a new family with which to start over again, and only this time it's a ready-made family. It's not Adam and Eve and then they have children. Noah and his wife already have the children, then Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, and so forth. So we move on from there then, and we see the calling of Abraham, and then we have the story of redemption, which really is Genesis 12 into the book of Revelation. It takes a long time, right? Now, one of the things that the Bible gives us is what we call sometimes called retribution theology. Sometimes it's called Deuteronomist theology, meaning it's theology that's taught largely in the book of Deuteronomy, or a theological concept. Okay? This is basically the principle supported in Scripture that God blesses those who obey Him. You want God to bless you? You do what He says. Honor your father and your mother, the law of Moses says, that it may be well with you and that your days may be long in the land which the Lord has given you. Serve God, obey him, honor him, and he will bless you with long life. He will bless you with health. He will bless you with wealth. He will bless you with all the things that you need. But disobey him, and you will fall under his punishment. Now, the best places where this, and I would encourage you, again, just to remind you that these PowerPoint presentations are always placed on the First Baptist ABC page. You can go and download these presentations, you can see. But I would encourage you to go and look at Leviticus 26 and look at Deuteronomy 28, because they do exactly that. They lay out all the blessings of Israel for their obedience and then the cursings for disobedience. Both Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 do that, right? So that's a basic principle. However, Scripture also shows us that there are some caveats or qualifications. It doesn't always work that simply. It is not that simple and formulaic. Let's give you some examples, okay? The story of Job, right? The story of Job. Job, we're told, was unlike any man on the face of the earth. When Satan comes before God and God says, where are you, what brings you here, sort of thing. And he says, well, I've been going up and down to and fro throughout the whole earth. And God says, well, if you consider my servant Job, there's no one like him in all the world. And Satan says, well, he knows which side his bread is buttered on. He's only going to serve you because you do good things to him. Right? Sounds like Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. He's just going to serve you because you do good things for him. Now, if you send some suffering his way, then we'll see how he responds. And, of course, we know how Job responds. Now, if you've ever read the story of Job, and I know you have, you will know that he suffered excruciating loss and pain due to this arrangement, as I call it, between God and Satan. Job is never, ever told what happened. Job's three friends, and then later on, Elihu, he comes and joins the party, and they all say the same thing. Job, you must have done something wrong. You wouldn't be suffering like this if you hadn't disobeyed God. Why don't you just repent and turn to God, ask for forgiveness, whatever sin it is? And Job says, no, I have not done this. And Job says some very interesting things. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I know that in my flesh I will see the Lord. The story of Job is fascinating. But even after Job is vindicated by God, God tells Job to pray. Well, he tells the three friends, I've asked Job to pray for you. That's the only chance you've got if Job prays for you, because you're wrong. Job is right about what he said. But God never says to Job in the narrative, by the way, Job, this is what was going on all along. You didn't know this, but there was this thing going on, and you did really good, Job. God never says that. He never tells him why he went through what he went through. The Psalms, all right, note especially Psalm 73. Psalm 73 is a psalm of Asaph, which is basically addressing the issue of why do the wicked prosper and the righteous go without, or the righteous suffer, or the righteous have horrible life experiences. Right? Why is this? And Asaph says, I had almost given up. I almost got to the point where I could not serve a God who blessed or allowed to be blessed his enemies, but caused his own people to be deprived and suffer. Now, he doesn't do that, and he says rather simply, he says, I went to the house of God, and then I understood their end. I understood what happened to them. But the problem of evil is one that's found repeatedly throughout the Psalms, as though God has forgotten his people. Okay? Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is one of those fascinating books. It'll fatigue your brain if you try to struggle with it. You have, everything is worthless, everything's meaningless, life can't be solved, and you have these statements about, when he says, how does he put it? He talks about the fact that, when I work really hard and I do all this stuff, but when I die, who knows? Somebody else will just ruin it and destroy it. And he just goes back and forth with the fact that we cannot fully understand life. So he comes down to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13. He says, what then is the conclusion of the matter? Fear God, keep his commandments, that it may go well with you. And in other words, we can't figure out God's ways. God's ways are beyond us being able to figure them out because of who he is. Right? So God does not make all of his plans known to us. God does not have an obligation to explain himself to us. Don't we wish that he did? I know I have had that many times. Why does God allow just random, excruciating suffering and pain and death? The book of Ecclesiastes, there's all kinds of stuff in Ecclesiastes. I did a first-person sermon once at my former church on Ecclesiastes. I don't know if I ever told you this or not. But what I did was I recorded the book of Ecclesiastes. This was the opening series of the message. I recorded the book of Ecclesiastes onto a CD, and I dressed up like biblical times, and I had all these props. Nancy, her expertise in theater props was very helpful. I had a big sword and a rope and all kinds of stuff. And so I recited, I had this, underneath all my outfit, I had this CD player and I had earphones. So as I could hear the text, I would say it and speak it as though I was I did several run-throughs. I'd like to have memorized it, but I just didn't have the time. Plus, I'm getting to the point where I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, so I didn't want to risk the whole book of Ecclesiastes. But there's a place in Ecclesiastes where the author is so frustrated. He says, I can't trust one man in 1,000, and I can't trust any women at all. That's what he says. Look it up. It's there, okay? And I read that statement, or I recited that statement, and apparently one of the ladies who was sitting behind my wife leaned over to her husband. She said, that's not true. Look it up. Don't shoot the messenger, okay? But Ecclesiastes clearly shows us that life does not, quote-unquote, make sense much of the time. Right? The prophets often speak to God asking him why he does not listen or help. Why does he tolerate wrongdoing and pervert justice? We just finished a little mini-series in Band of Brothers, and we looked at the book of Habakkuk, and this is exactly what the book of Habakkuk is all about. And let me just read the first 4 verses. This is Habakkuk speaking to God about all the sin, all the idolatry, all the evil that's taking place in Judah. He says, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? It's quite a way to talk to God. Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Now, Habakkuk's going to find out that God's going to say, don't worry, I'm going to take care of all this evil in Judah. I'm going to bring the Babylonians over to destroy everything. And Habakkuk is like, that's even worse. You're going to bring this horrible nation over to do this? Right? So, again, the Apostle Paul speaks of participation in Jesus' sufferings, becoming like him in his death. Again, Philippians 3, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. We looked at this passage recently, a couple of times actually. That I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship or the participation in his sufferings. Jesus said, the disciple's not above his master. Why would you disciples think that they're going to treat you any differently than the way they treated me? Today we will examine some significance of Paul's thorn in the flesh, and that's what I want to spend the rest of the time doing. Okay? First of all, this chapter finishes in its beginning. It's the beginning of the chapter, but it actually ends, as I said, a discussion that Paul has been having about himself and the so-called super apostles who came to Corinth, and Paul calls them false apostles. So in chapter 12, verse 1, he says, I must go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. So Paul says, these false apostles are bragging and boasting. That's pointless. It's worthless. I could do it. In fact, I'll do it. And he does it for a while. And says, see, I do this, and you know what? Everything I said is true about all the things that he's been used for God, but God has used him for, all the things he's accomplished. But he says it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. In Philippians, another place, he says, all the things that I've done, I consider them refuse. I consider them garbage when, comparable to the fully knowing of Christ. So, first of all, he wants them to know that if you're going to boast, you have to boast in the right things, not just boast in yourself. And he said, I could do that. And I would be right. It would be true. I was thinking about this when I was looking over this passage again last night. And I was thinking about, you need to know that I, as your pastor, am deeply flawed. I am. I just am. I'm not going to get up here for a moment and pretend like, I've accomplished all these great things. And maybe, I don't know, I don't even want to go there. Okay, I don't even want to go there. If Paul doesn't really want to go there, then I don't need to, because I don't have a bunch of super apostles running around here trying to shoot me down, okay, at least as far as I know, okay. I'll keep my eyes on some of you. No, I'm kidding. But he wants them to know that his boasting, had he decided to boast in these things, his boasting would have been accurate, but it would have been inappropriate. It would have been meaningless. Right? So if I were to stand before you and say, I'm actually a pretty good ping pong player. I really am, okay? If you don't believe me, ask Mark Poland. He'll tell you. Okay? I went up to camp a few years ago, and, I said, Pastor, you want to play? Sure. And I said, so Mark, I'm having fun with Mark. He's going to, sorry, Mark, hope you don't see this. No. He said something about, I said, yeah, I've played a bit. So we played, and I beat him pretty comfortably, to be honest with you. And he'll admit it if he... Now, what does that accomplish? So I get up here and I'm a better ping pong player than else. May true, or may not be. In this case it is, but so what? Okay? So what? Paul says, hey, I can boast. I can boast about all these visions and revelations. I can boast about all these things. But you know what? It doesn't mean anything. Because it doesn't help. It doesn't build people up. It doesn't encourage them. It means nothing. Okay? If you have the privilege of none of us knows when we're going to be in the presence of the Lord, but if I have the privilege of having my remains here for a funeral, you're not going to remember that. You're not going to remember what kind of a ping pong player I was. You're not going to remember anything about it. You're going to remember the kinds of things that Paul talks about, hopefully. Boasting, not appropriate. Secondly, though, he does say this. He says he specifically boasts about a man being caught up to the third heaven. He states that he will not boast about such things, but only about his weaknesses. Look at verses 2 through 5. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. In other words, he boasts about the fact that God has been able to use him in spite of his ineffectiveness, in spite of his weakness. His desire is to serve God, and that the weaknesses and the challenges that he has faced actually have helped him to be a more faithful servant of Christ. Third, Paul states that he could boast about such. This is what I was alluding to a minute ago. He says he could boast about such things, and such boasts would be true. But he will only boast of his weaknesses because otherwise the focus would be on himself and not on Christ. Sometimes, what he's saying here is sometimes he has experienced persecution and trials and weaknesses and that sort of stuff because it has forced him to not put himself out there, but rather to boast about Christ and focus on Christ. It is much more important that you and I know the Jesus that we want to introduce to them rather than just know about how great you and I are. It's important to keep that perspective. Look at verses 6 and the first part of verse 7. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or I say. So he says, I could boast about all the things I've done. I could boast about stuff that these super apostles have never even come close to. And I could do it in a way that would be very truthful and would be, if someone were objectively looking who's done more greater things, whatever, hands down it'd be me. That's what he's saying. I could boast about that. And my boasting would be true. Verse 7. Or because of these, he says, but I refrain so no one will think of me, more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. In other words, this is the expression, it's not about me, Paul says. It's not about me. I could boast about things, and those things would be true, but they're irrelevant. They're not even appropriate. Okay? So if I'm driving down the road and I have a flat tire, and somebody offers to come and help me change my tire, and while he's getting ready to change my tire, he says, hey, can I tell you about what a great trumpet player I am? No. I need my tire fixed, okay? I don't care. I don't care how, you may be, well, let me pull out my trumpet, and so he pulls his trumpet out, and he plays it, and he's great. He's right. But how does it help me? I want to get my tire fixed, okay? So Paul says, I could boast, I could tell you all kinds of great things about me, but he said, and they'd be true. And they'd be true. But they're irrelevant. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about him. Okay? So the focus has to be on Jesus. Fourth, Paul was, and this is where this question has been asked many times. What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? If you want to have fun, Google that question. What was Paul's thorn in the flesh, or Paul's thorn in the flesh? And you'll find almost as many answers as you do answerers or responders. Not quite, but it seems that way. So verse 7, last half of verse 7, he says, therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it from me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. There's a lot of speculation as to what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. One of them is that Paul was not married and did not have a spouse, and perhaps he would have liked to have one, and he did not. There is no evidence of Paul being married, no incontrovertible evidence at all that Paul was married. Some think that Paul was married when he became a follower of Christ, and then when he abandoned Pharisaism, in a sense, or Judaism as opposed to, rather than Jesus, that his wife left him. Well, we don't really have there's no biblical evidence of that. There's a possibility that he might have had some vision problems. This is, I think, more possible based on the evidence. For example, when Paul writes to, I think it's the Galatians, that he says to them, you were so, in fact, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me if you could. Some people think, maybe Paul had eyesight problems. Well, wasn't he struck blind on the road to Damascus? Sure, but then he was healed by, in Damascus there, okay? When, So I can't boast about my memory today. In the book of Acts, the guy that, God used him to heal Paul's vision, Ananias, okay? Not the bad Ananias who lied about money, given his money to the apostles. The good Ananias, okay? Well, that's true, but we also know that Paul was stoned and left for dead in Lystra after that. Maybe he had some injuries to his eyes. Again, it's all speculation. We know that Paul traveled a lot through the hill country of Asia Minor, and there's a lot of malaria there. He may have contracted malaria. There's no end to the speculation. The fact is, we do not know what it was. What we do know is this: he asked God 3 times to take it away, and God said no. He prayed, he besought, he asked. This is a guy who, according to the book of Acts, could heal others. Right? The father of Sergius Paulus, the administrator there on the Isle of Cyprus. We know that, according to the book of Acts narrative, when Paul is on the island of Malta after the shipwreck, he's carrying some wood for the campfire, for the campfire, but you know what I mean, the big fire where they're cooking and everything. And he puts some wood on the fire, and there's a snake in the wood, and it comes out and it bites his hand, and he shakes the snake off into the fire. And some of the people from the Maltese, the people from Malta, they say, oh, this guy must be a murderer because he's escaped the sea, but justice hasn't seen fit to let him live. And so for the next few hours, they watched him, and he just carried on. Nothing happened. He didn't swell up. He didn't keel over dead. So we know that there were times when God used Paul to heal others, and God even healed Paul himself. But not here. The thorn in the flesh, we don't know what it was, but he says, this was given to me to make me humble. I don't know about you, but I'd rather be given, just give me the humility straight, okay? Just don't give me anything bad that makes me humble. That's what I would like. Right? But we don't know what the thorn was. But, last of all, as a result of this thorn in the flesh, Paul states the following. He says, and let me read it here from the text. He says, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. There is a genuineness to your and my witness for Christ when, despite the sufferings and the challenges that we face, that it's not about us, it's about Him. It's about sharing the good news of Jesus, realizing nobody wants to go through, nobody wants a thorn in the flesh. I doubt that there would be a lineup of people asking for that. Nobody wants that. I don't want that. You don't want that. I want to be healthy and strong and, be able to move well on into my late 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, maybe even a few hundreds. I don't know. Okay. But that's what I want to do, okay? If it were up to me, he says, that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses. Wow. I don't know about you, but I'm not there. I'm just not there. At least not yet. I delight in weaknesses. I delight in insults. I don't like being insulted. Now he's talking about by enemies of the cross, enemies of the gospel, I'm sure. I delight in hardships. Tribulation brings about patience, endurance, hope, Romans 5. Right? That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions. I do not delight in persecutions. I don't. I can't even imagine what that looks like. I'm not saying I disagree with the text, don't misunderstand. I'm just saying, how does one go about delighting in persecutions? Oh, this is wonderful. I would suggest to you, I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I would suggest to you that that's what's coming down the pike for us. And I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what it's going to amount to. But if you stand for what the Bible stands for, believe me when I tell you this, it's going to get worse and more challenging for us and not better. So I just really believe that. So, it's interesting. Some of the church fathers made the point that, it's the persecution that really kind of reveals who the true believers are. It's easy to be a Christian when, being a Christian, you just float with the cultural mainstream. But when you become a follower of Christ, then the culture takes you to task, and the culture attacks you and criticizes you and tries to exclude you and tries to threaten you. That's not easy. That's what Paul says. In difficulties, he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. There's something about being caught up in this thorn in the flesh that he has pleaded with God to remove 3 different times, and God says, no. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. There's something about that makes him more effective than he would be otherwise. When I am weak, then I am strong. Now, of course, he doesn't mean himself. He means that he's strong with the power of Christ and what Christ has blessed him with. This is not, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, I liked you better last week. Easter Sunday and resurrection, all that sort of stuff. I get it. I liked me better last week, too. This is not easy stuff to preach, but it's there, okay? We're going to do probably about 4 weeks or so with this and look at other aspects of this issue. What does Paul mean when he talks about, to experience the sharing or the fellowship of Jesus' sufferings. I don't like suffering, and I'm sure you don't either. But there are some lessons that we can learn. Just because we are going through a time of suffering does not mean, A, that God has abandoned us, does not mean that, B, that our faith is weak somehow. I mean, the Apostle Paul, seriously? Things worth thinking about, I trust. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your truth, even when it's tough and it's challenging to us. But Lord, you've got